Hi and welcome to Blueprint Implementable Event. What we're going to do in this video is make one of these things, a Blueprint Implementable Event, and it's going to allow us to create an event in Blueprint that tells Blueprint when to create the UI for the crosshair once the aiming component has been found. We'll also talk slightly more widely about the architecture of the project. So I'll see you in there. What we want to do is have an event, not begin play, but another event of our own called found aiming component. And that is going to also pass out a variable, which is going to be the aiming component, and then that's going to trigger the creation of the UI and the setting of the Blueprint reference. Let's summarize that. We want to expose a C++ function to Blueprint. We also want to pass out a parameter into Blueprint, the aiming component reference. Multicast delegates only work for actors. So we've used multicast delegates before for this in Building Escape, but they only work for actors. They don't work for components like this. We're not going to be able to expose them to Blueprint how we want. So as we're using a component, we're going to use a U function called Blueprint Implementable Event. It's actually somewhat easier to use. And strangely, you don't even need to define the function in question. Let's look at this and see how it works. So I'll do the C++ with you, and then you can go ahead and do the wiring up in Blueprint. So let's start at the top of the class, actually. Look, our copyright notice isn't filled out, so let's just do that. Whenever I touch a class now, I want to clean it up. So I'm going to fill out my copyright notice. I'm going to write what this class is about. Responsible for helping the player aim. There's a bit of question mark over whether this is all that the tank player controller does, but let's worry about that later. As long as we put something, we can read it and critique it later. Let's get down to the meat and veg of this bit, which is in protected. Why protected? Because the place we're going to use this event is in a Blueprint that is a subclass of the tank player controller. Indeed, you can click tank player controller to go straight back to it. So it's protected. Now it's U function. Oh dear. Okay, and then it's Blueprint. Now spell it carefully. Implementable event. I think that's correct. I'm going to say the category, and we're always going to use a category now just to reinforce the habit, equals setup. Okay, so that's the annotation. Then what we're going to have is a method called something like, and it's going to be a void, nothing needs to come back, found aiming component, and it's going to pass out a utank aiming component pointer called aiming comp ref. Okay, so that's fine. It's a bit weird that this thing's going to be an event that comes out in Blueprint, and yet it's a parameter, but this is just the way we define it. Now, we've used utank aiming component pointer. Whether or not that works, it may even work because of the niceties of this macro. We want to do a forward declaration. As soon as you start using a type in a header file, you need to put a forward declaration in. And yeah, that should be it. Let's make sure that we can compile this. Now, you might say, how will this compile when there is no implementation of this found aiming component method? We actually don't need to implement it with this macro in place. So let's see if it compiles. We've got a problem in the compilation. Unrecognized type utank aiming component. That's Y. So let's try it again. Now, by the way, while that's compiling, if you want to know what happens to your code after the header tool gets to it, you can look if you want. It'll scare you, but you can look at the generated file. So you'll find tank aiming component. Are we on that? No, tank player controller generated.h, and that will show you what your file looks like just before it gets compiled after the Unreal header tool and the macros have been expanded. So I wouldn't bother, but it's there if you want to wonder about how that works. Now, has this compiled? Yes, it has compiled. The game still plays. That's very strange, right? Because we have not implemented this found aiming component. Oh, well. Okay, so let's go over to the Blueprint and let's go and find it. Look, event found aiming component. There it is. And it's passing out the aiming component reference. That is cool. Okay, good. Now, before I hand it over to you, we need to go to the tank player controller CPP file, and we actually need to, at some point, broadcast on this event. Now, the way you do that is not with the broadcast keyword. It's a little bit different. What you do is you just call found aiming component with the aiming component. And that's it. What we should do later is actually, we better do it now. Get some protection around it. Yeah, and also we need to find the aiming component. So let's go find this aiming component. This is a slightly different piece of work for you. Auto aiming component. Now, the way we can find it, we actually don't need in future to keep an aiming component pointer here on the tank. And you'll see why, because what we can do is Unreal provides this functionality for us. We can say auto aiming component equals get control tank, and then we can look through the control tank and say find component by class uTank aiming component in a generics format like that. Now what that's doing is very much what we did here. Get control tank, get components by class. In Blueprint it returns an array and we get the first one. Over here in C++ is exactly the same thing, but it returns a single component, not components. In this case we assume that we have one. Then we can say if we have an aiming component, auto component, look at me. If we have an aiming component, then in fact on my version of Visual Studio I can do that, which is highlight the line and hit the left chevron or left curly brace. Otherwise, what do you do if you don't have an aiming component? Well, I think we should log something out. By the begin play, we really should have an aiming component because of what we talked about before in the previous lecture here. The tank's constructor and its aiming components constructor should already have run in the constructors. So by the time we get over here into the player controller blueprint, on begin play, we should already have this aiming component added to the tank. And if we find it this way by finding component by class, it should be there. If it's not there, then we probably want to log out a warning that says something like player controller can't find aiming component at begin play, or something like that. All right, so that's the code I've written there. Now I've misspelled get control tank. Otherwise, I think it looks okay. Yep, so that's the new code is what I've highlighted. Let's see if it'll compile. Go back to the code while it's compiling so you can see what's going on. And hopefully you can see what we're doing there. We're finding the aiming component a different way from the player controller. We're looking through the tank to the aiming component. And this could be a better architecture looking forward for the aiming component and the movement component. Perhaps the tank itself needs to do almost nothing and we just look through it as a placeholder object. That would be a pure component-based architecture. So that reload, compile has failed. In the CPP line 11, let's read the error message. Template, okay, so the class that I'm specifying must be, okay, I see what's going on. So I've used uTank aiming component there, but it doesn't know anything about that. So we need to hash include the tank aiming component.h. It's a bit of an obscure message for the fact that I haven't included the tank aiming component, but that's the sort of stuff you're going to get out of the Unreal compiler. So just kind of read past the message if you can and think, well, what could be going wrong here? Okay, so the compile is complete and we can play and it works. Okay, fantastic. So what I want you to do now is to rewire this blueprint to make sure you've understood what we've done. So let's get through to that. Go to the tank player controller blueprint. Use the event to trigger the UI creation. So instead of begin play, we're going to use the event we just made. Also use the past reference to set that blueprint variable on the right-hand side of the blueprint. And test that the crosshair color now tracks the enum state that was set in the declaration of the enum. Okay, and you might want to change it and recompile just to check. So go ahead, pause the video and see if that's all working now. Okie dokie, welcome back. So we don't need the begin play event. We don't need any of this code up here. This is exactly the sort of thing we don't want to be seeing in Blueprint. Only very basic asset referencing and UI component creation. So now we've got something along these lines. Let me get rid of the details tab, zoom in so you can see what's going on a little bit. Great. So we have this aiming component. What we want to do once we find that is we want to trigger the UI creation. So actually I do need it to be on the left-hand side. So now, when the aiming component is found on begin play, we create the UI and then we pass the aiming component reference over here to this blueprint variable. It's not really any way to make this perfectly neat, so I think I'll just leave it like that. It's pretty clear what's going on. We create the blueprint widget, add it to the viewport. We have to pass a reference, but we're also going to need a reference to this widget so that we know the target of this blueprint aiming component reference, so that when we get over here into the blueprint, player UI blueprint, this aiming component reference is set. Okay, let's compile this guy up. Play the game. It's green now. Okay, now let's check that's right. So green would be an enum value of locked. Let's go and look at the place this is initialized, which is in the tank aiming component header file, locked. That's great. And you could change that and convince yourself that if you change the default firing state, that the UI now reflects it. Now this is a much, much nicer architecture we've got ourselves here. And we're ready to make the UI state change in the aiming component. The only thing is, I would say right now, is that the aiming is not happening. So we have sorted out our UI. What we need to think about next is how are we going to get a aiming component reference working inside the tank. Remember, we still, in the tank CPP constructor, we removed the default subobject. We added the aiming component to the tank in Blueprint here, and yet the tank still doesn't have a concept of its aiming component. So we're going to turn this architecture inside out, actually, and we're going to remove the aiming component references from the tank and make things work a different way so that you're going to talk direct to the component. It's going to be another way of doing things. I want you to see it this way because you'll see this way done and you may choose to do things this way, but I also want to show you another way. This part of the project really puts pressure on our architecture. So I hope you'll excuse me taking you down this route. It's quite important that you see these ways of adjusting and inverting your architecture and inverting your dependencies. I already have a prototype that's running for this game. I posted that to Facebook weeks ago, but I do not want to give you a completely sterile journey, because if I do that, when you get yourself stuck architecturally, you're not going to have the experience to pull yourself out of it. So let's look forward to continuing to refactor and improve our architecture and look at the consequences of doing that. So I'll see you in the next video.